Many of Australia's surviving and extinct species were documented 150 years ago by the famous British ornithologist and zoologist John Gould in a landmark series of books. Fred Ford is a modern-day zoologist, and he's put aside his interest in checking out owl vomit and crawling into tight caves to revisit Gould's remarkable work through his own book. This book's called John Gould's Extinct and Endangered Mammals of Australia. Fred, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Cam.
Let's start with some about John Gould first. People will be, I imagine most people are familiar with his work around birds. How extensive is his work on Australian mammals?
Yes, certainly birds is what John Gould's most known for. He produced a number of really quite lavish works on birds of Asia and Europe, and really built a reputation both as a preparator of birds in terms of making stuffed specimens for both museum collections and also just for people's collections, because in the Victorian period people were extremely fond of having shiny things, and biological specimens were often seen as a real trophy, in inverted commas, I guess, for decorating the house and showing some prestige. And really the mammal side of Gould's work was a bit of a sideline when he came to Australia. He was coming to Australia for the dedicated purpose of making a comprehensive work of Australia's birds to follow on from the work he'd already done. And that's really what funded his trip to Australia. So he advertised before he came out that he was going to do this work, and took subscriptions from people that wanted to get these very large, very colourful folios describing and illustrating the birds that he was going to make. But before he came out, he was a very active member of the London zoological community and the Royal Society. So he, again, part of his reputation was working on the birds that Charles Darwin had collected on the voyage of the Beagle. So he really was seen in the upper echelons of the Zoological Society in London. And so the people that he was talking to there firmly were pushing him towards also collecting and at least bringing back to London so that other people could look at the mammals. But clearly once he got here, he began to understand that there was a very diverse and interesting fauna of things that he clearly grew quite fond of while he was here.
Became more than a sideline interest, didn't it? There was the 3 volumes, ultimately, of the mammals of Australia. Where exactly did he document them?
In terms of the places in Australia, he actually started off in Tasmania, and him and his collector that he brought out with him, John Gilbert, in 1838, started collecting through Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land then, and he pretty quickly realised that there was such a task that he was going to have to split efforts, and sent Gilbert off to Western Australia, which was really a very small colony of Swan River at that point. And Gould himself started working in South Australia and New South Wales, basically just to try and get as broad a scope as he could. And then after Gould left, Gilbert also went back to England, but came back out again and started working through Queensland and joined Leichhardt's expedition as well. So he really got quite a large sampling right the way across Australia, and including Port Essington, and right in the top end, which was one of the very first outposts in that part of the continent.
So there's a lot to really enjoy about this book, and the images are part of, no small part of that. But what's really grabbed me is what it tells us about our attitudes, or Australian attitudes, early attitudes to Australian native animals. What does Gould's work, what sort of insight does Gould's work give you to those attitudes?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing, and it's something that I was aware of before the book, but through researching the book and looking much more at, rather than formal works, but at first-hand accounts from letters in newspapers and stories that people had written, it really emphasised to me that change from, in the early days, you can imagine that people are coming from England to a very foreign country, but there's a real curiosity in all echelons of society, from convicts right through to governors, about what sort of animals there are out there, because there's always the chance of finding the next platypus or some bizarre curio, but also which ones were good to eat, which ones had a potential for farming, which ones would be potentially domesticatable.
It seems to me that's how an animal its value was perceived. Could it be eaten? Could it be traded?
Absolutely. The first and foremost value on things, particularly you've got to remember there's a very small numbers of people with very, very long supply chains back to England. So anything that was of potential value to those people that was already in Australia that could obviously cope with the conditions, that could be a source of fur instead of wool or any resource, was of great value. And particularly for the poorer people, as settlements started to spread out into the broader countryside, with no money and the capacity just to live off the land, obviously the first thing you might be able to turn to before you've managed to clear trees and set wheat and do the other things that people were more familiar with was to actually find out what the country could provide to you of itself.
You're hearing here from Fred Ford, zoologist, and the man behind the book, John Gould's Extinct and Endangered Mammals of Australia. We've also got Joe Karma with you. Joe's the book editor. Joe, thanks for holding on there. What have you learnt about our early attitudes to native animals in the process of putting this book together?
I've learnt a lot about it, and as Fred said, it wasn't so much what Gould said himself, but it's the little newspaper reports. That the attitudes towards the so-called pests, the pests being the thylacine, Tasmanian devils, quolls.
Pest was not introduced animal back then, was it?
No, no, it wasn't. It wasn't. It was, the thylacine and the devils were sort of bloodthirsty animals which killed the farmers' sheep, and the quolls were always in the hen house destroying hens, and the bandicoots were digging up people's lawns, and this was appalling. I mean, some of the attitudes, I've got a quote here, calling the thylacine a wretched marauder, first among the countless vermin of the region. And a description in the London Daily Mail described it as one of the most stupid animals. Its lack of intelligence is the cause of its untamableness. It's...
And so it seems that Gould was obviously aware of this was how these animals were perceived locally. And is it fair to say that's what led to some of his predictions of extinction?
Yes, that's right. That, the thylacine, there were bounties on various animals, the thylacine being one of them, and he did predict that the thylacine would disappear. And it did. He also predicted that the koala would disappear, but it wasn't until fairly recently that was put on the National Endangered list. I don't know, what date was that, Fred?
In 2012.
2012.
Because I guess there's, I learned about people going out to shoot numerous animals, including koalas, and the extent to which their pelts had been traded through this book. I wasn't aware of that.
Oh, yes. Yeah, thousands and thousands and thousands of koala pelts were traded. And it wasn't just the trading, it wasn't just the fur, that they and other animals were used as sport, that people would just go out and take pot shots at these animals just for the hell of it. And in the book there's this wonderful picture of a gunman who's bracing himself against a tree, aiming high up into the tree to shoot a poor defenceless koala. But apparently the koalas learnt that when gunmen were around, that they had to climb up higher and higher as the guns got more powerful and could shoot further. So they weren't stupid about it.
Mm-hmm. Fred, you start the book. We've mentioned the thylacine. It's the first animal you look at in your book, the Tasmanian tiger. Why did you begin there?
I think it's a natural place, really, to start with any discussion of Australian extinction, because it's worldwide. It's right up there as one of the iconic stories of extinction, next to the dodo, really. And it's a really interesting one in terms of people's attitude, because one of the melancholy elements of Gould's description of the inevitable demise of the thylacine was everyone could see it happening, and that goes for everyone around the world. Foreign accounts at the same time, right through the late 1800s and early 1900s, all alluded to the fact that the thylacine was going to go extinct and that it was a tragedy. But on top of that, recognising much like your last speaker was talking about, that it was a genuine threat to the industries and agriculture and pastoralism in Tasmania. So there was an understanding at that stage that the duality of the paradox of the situation, that there was an animal that was so unique and so different to anything else in the world, and it was a tragedy that it would be lost, but also that it was going to be lost unless it was... I think the Tasmanian Parliament in debate went, all right, well, if we're going to have them, we've got to get them as far away from everyone as possible, and brought in the notion of a tiger reserve on the west coast. But ironically, that didn't get instated until long after the last Tasmanian tiger had died. But
yeah. So, Fred, is there, in the course of researching this and putting this book together, do you feel there's anything from the historical examples here that we could learn and apply to conservation today?
Yeah, certainly. I think some of the key messages really are around something that Joe touched on, that a lot of these animals have an innate ability to be pests. If you give them the right set of circumstances, things like bettongs and bandicoots can do fantastically well. If you take foxes out of the equation, and we see this in many very active recovery efforts around the country now, if you put up fences and you control foxes, cats, rabbits, you can have problems, again, somewhat paradoxically, too many bettongs, too many bilbies. They dig holes, they're a nuisance, which is great. It's a great problem to have. And if you look at the early days of settlement, before rabbits and foxes really swept across the landscape, they're the problems people had. Even in the local area here in Canberra, there's many accounts of people getting sick of bettongs eating their potato crops, and in South Australia, stories of bettongs wandering into people's houses and stealing food. So it'd be fantastic if we got a glimpse of that again.
We've always had this tension, haven't we? The interface between humans and animals. Look, Fred, it's a beautiful book. Congratulations on it. Thank you for telling us all about it today. Fred Ford, zoologist, and his book is John Gould's Extinct and Endangered Mammals of Australia. And Joe Carmel is the book editor. Joe, thanks for coming in today. I appreciate it. It's a book that's published on the 1st of October by National Library of Australia Publishing.